I want to start quickly with just having you guys do the 90 seconds, explain it to me like I'm 5 version of a definition, so at least we can work from a common definition. I want both of you to take a crack at it, and I don't want you to take a long time.
Oh, okay, I'll go first. So remember, until we all agree, we can't eat lobster, so just agree with me and we'll be done with this. MMT is basically the idea that money is more important than interest rates, and that if you create money to buy debt, you can then expand the economy. That's where Kelton's deficit myth comes from. Just spend and you will expand the economy. Now, it gets a bad rap because people then say, well, of course that's going to create inflation. And the MMTers would argue to you, yeah, there is a point out there that if you create too much money, you will have inflation. Their fix is, or their argument is, it's not interest rates that would then rein that in. If you printed too much money, raise interest rates to rein that in. It's taxes. So in the stylized MMT world, you would have interest rates at 0, and you'd have tax rates go up and down like currently interest rates do, sort of kind of set by a board like the Federal Reserve. Now, the problem with that is, I said in the stylized world, well, I don't know if people would like the idea of some kind of a board setting tax rates every couple of times a year based on the growth rate of the economy, lower them to speed it up, raise them to slow it down, and keep interest rates at some kind of a level, because taxes could never really be set by a market force. Yeah. So I'll stop there and I'll let Sam jump in.
So that sounds like that'll never happen, so we don't have to talk about that.
Yeah, the best part about MMT is that we can talk about it all we want to, and it'll never really happen in its purest form, like capitalism. But the problem with the interesting part about MMT is that we get to talk about it, and it's really intriguing, and it does actually have some fundamental implications for how we view both the world around us, the way that equity markets react, interest rates, et cetera, et cetera. The really interesting part that gets overlooked all the time is it's never actually going to be implemented in its perfect form, very similar to capitalism. So we can critique MMT all we want, just the way that we critique Keynesianism, which has never actually been implemented perfectly. But at the end of the day, MMT is not that bad of a theory for understanding how to invest, how to think about the world, and how to actually react to the fundamental way that monetary policy is implemented, fiscal policy is implemented, and I'll let it go from there.
Okay, great. So we were here however many years ago while we were printing a lot of money around the pandemic, and you coined the term accidental MMT. Like, we were going to get in the laboratory some of this stuff out loud, and that was pretty cool, right? Because economics is not usually an experimental science. We don't get to run a lot of tests. So what did we learn about MMT principles? Again, this isn't about like, yay, boo, MMT. Like, what does MMT tell us about what we did in the pandemic?
So the first thing that it actually tells us is MMT is the way that monetary policy is being run, right? Whether we like it or not. Again, this is not a popularity contest. This is a how does the world work and how do we think about it? MMT is the actual fundamental way that monetary policy and fiscal policy are being run in the United States from a ground-up basis. It doesn't matter that we don't like it, right? I mean, we can say we shouldn't really do it. We can say, yeah, we don't like the spending, but at the end of the day, it's exactly what is going to occur every time that some sort of bump happens to the global economy. What I think is being slightly leaned against that shouldn't be is that somehow the Federal Reserve is responsible for all of the inflation that's out there, when you had an incredible amount of fiscal policy that was not counteracted on the other side. So it's pretty difficult to say that you pump, call it 10 to 15% of GDP into the economy in fast money, and you're not going to have some sort of demand-supply imbalance. the other side of it is, what in the world is the Fed supposed to do with that when it's a by construction slow-moving entity? It's not going to be able to counteract that. MMT's fundamental trigger would have been higher, fiscal, but
Jim. It was a simple question and it was a long answer. It usually goes the other way around. Jim, do you agree that we are basically in MMT land right now? Is that a useful framework for evaluating where we are? Because I run into this and I think, well, okay, so we spent a lot of money and we had some inflation. As an idiot, that feels like it sort of worked. Was it too much inflation? Was it not enough? I don't know. That's your job. But does MMT help us understand it? Because we're not like hyper-adjusting tax rates and all that.
Yeah, no, well, I think we've been in MMT even longer than that. The whole idea of quantitative easing with permanent open market operations was, put it simply, the Fed prints money and then they buy bonds. And they allow the government to continue to run large budget deficits, and they continue to let the government expand and become larger parts of the economy. And the reason I bring that up is I'll give you one statistic. Currently, government spending is $6 trillion, or about 22% of GDP. There's only been 2 times in American history it's been higher than 22% of GDP. That was the COVID response, and that was the very end of World War II. Usually we are kind of a Keynesian kind of economy where we spend a lot of money to stimulate an economy in a recession, and we see spending go up. We're higher now than we are in most recessions. So we are spending money today as if we are in a recession, but we're in year 5 of a recovery. And that is all part of this MMT thing, that the ability of the Fed to print money to permanent open market operations by buying bonds has been allowing that kind of framework to come along. And I might add, that's why Kelton and Mosler wrote the book and got popular, because they were basically putting a framework on what we were already doing for a long period of time.
What do you think the most adamant critiques of MMT are that are valid, right? Because it's really easy to be like, well, you can't just spend all your money. Like, where is it really a breakdown other than its sort of fictitiousness? I mean, it's a perfect system that can't be implemented, blah, blah, blah.
I would say that the positive critique is MMT is a good description of how the world works. That when you print money, you get the results that you want, and if you print too much, you'll get inflation. And we don't really know what that level is out there that when we've tripped over. But is a prescription, so therefore now that we've described it, therefore we should use it as a policy. We've talked about here some of the limitations on it. Like I said, having some kind of a federal government board regularly changing tax levels to try and regulate the economy is a big non-starter.
I would say the best critique of MMT is Germany. Germany has like a 70% debt to GDP and has been underperforming radically because it won't spend anything. I would say the interesting part about that is if you had your own central bank, you could probably actually lever up and get that economy moving again. They don't, so they can't actually implement any form of MMT. So the major critique of MMT is it's not able to actually be applied to the real world in a real way. Otherwise, you could actually have some much better outcomes.
So one of the things that obviously is terrifying when I hear people talk about this as a normal citizen person is the idea that, well, if you can just spend all the money, then who's in charge of spending all the money becomes extraordinarily important. And we know for the most part that means, our highly functional and quick and easy budget process, et cetera, and all the various things we add on after the fact, social programs, whether we're going to do universal health care, like that's been part of the selling point. Certainly from the left side of the aisle on MMT ideas is you can fund all these giant social programs. You can do all of these sort of big, programs from the government, which independently may be good or bad. But is there some concern that everybody all of a sudden adopts this as a mantra because it lets them just do whatever the hell they wanted to do in the first place?
I mean, there's always that, but the problem is that you don't have the ability to do it in the way that you think you have. So there's a couple of ways to think about that. One is, what is your funding ability? And the US's funding ability is everyone wants US dollars, right? So you have a significant amount of ability to fund a lot of things. The second part would be that it's not just a have everything you want, buy it all. There is part of MMT that says at some point you do have to raise taxes, you do have to slow this type of spending. It's not just a spend for all. It is very much a you can spend more than you think, particularly in kind of the current monetary Keynesian type framework that we would operate in mostly. But overall, I don't really see MMT as saying you can just spend it all. That is not really at the fundamental core of something that says.
Yeah, the only thing I would throw in there is, if you have the ability to borrow, print and borrow, should you? Well, it depends on the program, and it depends on the objective of the program. Of course, every program is supposed to be good, but the reality is, if it is wasteful spending or if it is distortionary spending, it will produce an abnormal outcome for the economy, like inflation or something like that. If it is not, then the program won't produce an abnormal level for the economy. So that's the one thing we have to be careful of, is if we start to think, well, we could now run higher levels of government, we could have more programs, fine. But if those programs lead to bad incentives or adverse outcomes, there will be an impact on the economy. That's kind of outside the level of MMT. So you're kind of back to the same, you're back to question one, is this a good idea that we do this? Whether or not we have the ability, because it sounds like what we're saying is, since we have the ability to finance it, let's do it.
Right.
That's not a good way, that's not a good reason to do it. Is it a good reason to do, period, is the way we should attract all these questions.
I want to circle back to a question we dodged around but didn't really answer. Did we look, as a profession, did economists learn anything from what we did, like not just the US, but around the world, in response to the pandemic? In other words, because some of it happened on one watch, some of it happened on another watch, nobody thinks it was perfectly administered, whatever, I don't want to argue about that. Did we learn anything about what we're going to do the next time something big happens? Is this now doctrine? Did we learn a lot of lessons not to do certain things that we did? Where do we come out from that? Because, again, giant experiment, what do we really learn?
Am I allowed to say no? They're kind of slow and dumb and they No, I think that we learned a lot of things about what happened during the pandemic, because what we did is we had extreme policy. We had extreme policy in money supply. We had extreme policy in fiscal response. We had extreme policies all over. In fact, we had extreme policies with the lockdowns and the restarts. And we learned that I think what we've learned is that there's long-term incentives. And one, if you follow any of the work that I've been talking about, the big long-term incentive is we forever changed the workforce because of remote work now. That was a response from the pandemic. So when you push in extreme policy, you are going to produce a change in the status quo. And we produced a change in the status quo in the economy. And I think what economists need to understand is when you produce an extreme outcome, there's the idea that we're going to push something this way for a little while, and then when we need to, we'll just bring it right back to where it used to be. You never go back to where you used to be. So we forever changed the labor market, as one example of many.
Well, if we had another crisis, do you think whoever's in power would do something different because of the pandemic, or would they just use the playbook?
Well, they might use the same playbook, but I've been fond of saying that every crisis produces a change in the economy. And we change the economy. Change does not mean worse, it does not mean dystopian, it means it's different. And how long will this change last? Till the next crisis. And if we use the same playbook, we will change it again. And we'll have to figure out how, and it will be different. And the mistake we will make as economists is go, well, the last time this happened, this was the outcome. Well, we just changed it, and it ain't gonna work that way.
Sam?
So I would say a couple of things. One, you're going to get a very similar reaction in terms of the spend. It's just, what are you spending on? Is it a direct deposit into people's bank accounts again, or is it a bailout of banks, or is it a bailout of commercial real estate I have no idea, but I think what we learned this time around as economists is never underestimate the ability of the Fed to figure out a way to rewrite their legislation to buy whatever they want to buy, whenever they want to buy it, at whatever size they want to buy it. And so if we learned anything, it's what's the next asset class that the Fed's going to buy? And that's the only question you really have to figure out going into the next crisis.
Can I throw in just to follow up to the last one, what's the next asset class they're gonna buy? It's the only one they haven't bought yet, and that's equities. Because I mean, we've already went all the way down to junk bond ETFs the Fed was buying in the last one, so the next step is equities. We become the Bank of Japan then at that point.
Is that a bad thing?
No.
Yes and no. I mean, what I mean by, no, you could argue it might not be a bad thing if you think that prices should be elevated. But what I get worried about is, we forget what an equity is, right? We all think that they're little gambling chips. No, they're actually ownerships of companies. And if you have the Fed or the Treasury buy to try and support prices, now they got a proxy to get the vote. And that is probably the more dangerous thing that they're going to wind up doing than whether or not they're pushing prices up or down.
Fair.
By the way,
Right.
they already bought equity.
Right. So we're gonna open it up for about 10 minutes of
That was debt
questions.
possession financing, though.
Different.
Different.
David, sorry, well, hold on a second. Just rules of the game here, right? We have 2 people up here, we have a microphone, we're recording this. We can't have an open conversation with everybody. Everybody's here, we got lots of time to chat on the deck. We have a lot of people with a lot of opinions on this. This is questions for these 2, not just your opinion about everything we were just talking about. So if somebody has a question for these 2, I'd love to hear it, and I'll repeat it so that we get it on the video. David.
Lightning round with questions. I'll be very quick. Sam, you pointed to Germany. Target 2 balances is how many people may not be familiar with that, but target 2 balances is the way the European Central Bank balances assets and liabilities claims among the member countries. The European Central Bank created itself as another country and therefore then was a lender to itself and is in those balances. Is that pure MMT?
No.
All right, Barry.
So I'm intrigued by the concept of the Fed stepping in and buying not a specific company like GM or debtor in possession financing or anything like that, but hey, the market's getting shit canned, let's step in and be the plunge protection team. How realistic do either of you think that is as a future Fed policy?
They've already done it. They did it in 2020. They stepped in and they bought corporate bonds. They bought high yield ETFs.
Buying equity,
Yeah.
like buying the S&P 500, buying the
Can't get a little
Qs.
bit pregnant. They've already played the game now. We're just talking about what is the next asset class they're gonna play. And so that's what I mean by this, they've already done it. The only question the Fed is gonna have on their hands is whether or not Larry Fink gets to do it for them or they're gonna pick somebody else. So I think that it's almost inevitable that in the next crisis, I'm not saying there will be one, but in the next crisis, yeah, that'll be on the table.
And which of their dual mandate does that fall under? Which rubric does that come under?
Financial stability, the third unwritten, would be the same one that allowed them to buy the ETF HYG.
Yeah, so for both of you, have either of you heard anybody talking about in broad terms, not funding specific programs, but universal basic income as it's tied to MMT?
Great question. UBI and MMT.
No. You haven't seen a single bond issued from the U.S. government on a specific thing, right? At least in recent history. The likelihood that that happens is lower than buying equities.
Can I just ask you, Sam, though, when we had the direct deposit to checking accounts for the majority of Americans as a pandemic response, wasn't that an experiment of universal basic income?
No, that was you can't go to work, we should probably pay you instead of having you go, maybe not like us and murder your neighbors.
A quick word about the UBI thing. We are experimenting with UBI at the state and local levels. So we're getting a lot of different experimentation with it, and we'll find out what kind of incentive structures it builds in and what kind of reactions we get to those incentive structures.
I missed, Sam, did you agree with Jim's definition of what MMT was? Or did you have a different opinion on how you actually describe what MMT is? At the very start out, because Jim gave his description and you didn't, I didn't hear yours was different.
No, I did not disagree.
Okay,
at all.
perfect. Yeah, that's all I want to make sure.
That's actually been part of the problem planning for this, because honestly, there isn't that much disagreement about the reality of everything. So, Stu?
So, Sam, it seems to me that MMT at its heart continually debases the currency and therefore continually debases all savings and all assets,
Are
right?
we talking about Keynesianism or MMT?
No, I'm talking about MMT.
Okay.
So specifically, if you debase, I've saved X number of dollars, I've institutionalized this higher and higher inflation rate or higher tax rate. Seems to me like MMT is a direct assault on capital and savings in particular. You seem to not agree with that at all. Seems to me we're institutionalizing this
No,
inflation base.
I don't agree with that at all. No, I mean, so it's a difference between the way that it is from a theoretical perspective, that's not true at all. From a practical implication of the policies that have been implemented and will continue to be implemented, it may very well be true. But the differential between what MMT says should be done and what MMT is in practicality is two different things. So MMT does not say, I want to debase you to the moon. It says, you know, very similar things to Keynesianism, but with a much better picture of how it actually works within the modern political sphere.
Can I ask a dumb question about MMT, like from a structural level, that may be part of what you're getting at, Stu, which is, isn't the whole idea that you're literally just sort of making more money and you take it out of the system through taxation, and you have to imagine a world where we will literally just voluntarily crank up the taxation to not have what happened, what he's talking about, which just means you're sort of shifting the abuse, right?
Yeah. That is exactly correct. Yes,
Okay.
it's do you want your 2% inflation via the FOMC attempting to target, you know, an interest rate, or do you want a 2% inflation target via a fiscal and monetary policy that's tied together? That is all that is different between the two at a theoretical level. In practicality,
It will be much
it is much different.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Here.
So whether it's monetary stimulus or fiscal stimulus, all it's doing is pulling forward economic behavior. It's giving you money to spend now, it's cutting interest rates now to try to encourage you to buy a car or a home. So once that pull forward has sort of satisfied itself, then you are back to square one with a little bit of a hangover. Should MMT just be a perpetual thing to avoid the hangover after the pull forward?
So I just don't know how that's different than how we've tried to operate the economy over the last 75 years.
Yeah.
I mean, we've literally pulled forward everything by cutting interest rates, whether, or however we decided to do it, by interest rates, fiscal policy, whatever it might have been. MMT is just an easy target for, yeah, should we do that? I don't know. But do we do it? Yeah. So I don't really have a policy prescription for it. That's not really my game. But the reality is, yes, we are going to do it, and yes, we're going to do it in a big way.
Just a quick follow-up to just say something that I said before. MMT is about financing things. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. You know, remember the Robert Barrel ratio too, that any economic project that has a barrel ratio of over 1 means it produces more economic value than the inputs. Every private company is over 1. And so that's why they exist. Every private company less than 1 goes out of business. So if we're using MMT to finance a bunch of projects that have an economic value of less than 1, or maybe even negative.
We're screwed anyway, right?
Yeah, we just financing it,
Deflation.
arguing the way to finance it is not gonna be very fruitful. It's all gonna wind up failing anyway.
Constance?
It would be deflationary.
So, my quick question is, how many of you have read the book most in MMT. And so I just, it's not a the question is, have you read the book?
Can I make a quick comment about that?
No more questions. Talk related.
No, my follow-on question, to that point, doesn't this hit the brick wall of the U.S. Congress and the power of Congress to tax? I mean, that's not going to change.
Yeah,
so
because you
it's a
you
nice
give
theory,
that away. You give that away to some party because again, there is MMTers will admit there is a point at which you do go too far and you create inflation, and raising interest rates is not the efficient form to rein that in. It's suck money out of the system by raising taxes, and that's the problem that makes it unworkable.
And Mike Green, then you got a knock on the kitchen door
Got it.
and tell me we're done.
Mike Green, the last question. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, no, I mean, this was a very frustrating panel for me because I feel like, one, we didn't come to a common definition at the front, and two, there's been a caricature presented. MMT in its simplest form says the government does not face a financing constraint. That's it. Right? We are the issuer of our currency. We can't default on our currency. We can always print more of it, and that can create the debasement. Whether we choose to spend it on consumer goods, or whether we choose it to fight the Civil War, or whether we choose to spend it to build infrastructure that enhances the productivity capability of our nation, are choices that we have to make with that financing capability. It is the way we've always operated, even when we were on the gold standard, as the Civil War points out. It was a choice to maintain against that gold standard. We devalued against that gold standard multiple times, recognizing that it created a constraint that was artificial. So, like,
Did you have a question?
no. So the question I guess I would ask is, why would we actually go through this process and then misrepresent the entire system? Like, it has nothing to do with what we were talking about. It's not actually about, do we finance cars, right? Or do we devalue the currency? It's a question of how do we allocate the real resources in our society to enhance our outcomes. And if we don't trust the government to do that, that's a totally different statement, right? That's a totally different statement than saying this is either a bad idea or a good idea.
With that, we're going to have to wrap that up. Thank you, everybody.